Welcome to Solarpunk Presents Season 6, Episode 9, where we talk again with Andy Gross about Fully Automated, a really Solarpunk role-playing game.
Way back when we were planning the original chat with Andrew, one of the creators of the Fully Automated RPG, both Christina and I wanted to interview him, but then life happened, especially to Christina. If you're a Patreon member, you know a bit more about what happened, but suffice to say, it meant that I was the only one available to chat with Andy.
But I have listened to the episode, and I came away from it with a lot of questions that I would like to ask. And so this is my opportunity to ask a few of these questions that I couldn't ask because I wasn't there when the interview happened.
Before you do that, Christina, though, I was going to ask Andy if he could provide us with maybe just a short summation of what Fully Automated is, just to get us all on the same level.
Fully Automated is a tabletop role-playing game, but in a general sense, it's a project that includes a world guide that describes a Solarpunk world that is meant to be an easy scaffold for writing adventures on, particularly adventures of the kind of pulpy quality that people enjoy in comic books and mass market media, but in a larger sense, whatever it is that you want to do with it.
So as I was listening to your discussion, the discussion that the two of you had, I was really struck by the notion that these role-playing games in some way are kind of like a model, like almost like a computer model that scientists use to understand complex situations and see what kind of outcomes come when you have a lot of different factors interacting. And I suppose it's also, I'm thinking of this in terms of models I've used in geology or much more sophisticated ones that my colleagues have put together to study climate and biogeochemistry. But I suppose this also applies to the social sciences, where you're trying to see how human beings react, especially as groups or individuals that make up groups, to novel situations. And it seems like a role-playing game is kind of actually an analog way to do the same thing.
To back up, Christina, to your point that, yeah, this is a model of figuring out what's happening without having to sort of unethically, deal with large populations of people who might not maybe agree to all of the experiments that you're running because they might be dangerous or they might have some more ethical implications. But this is a way to do that in sort of the safe space of the imagination.
I was just going to add that that's actually a really astute observation, because a lot of role-playing games emerged out of government simulation exercises, a lot of war games, and then later diplomatic and like standoffs, like figuring out what to do between nations, pandemic and health responses. There's a huge history in RPGs that comes out of simulations, actually.
I didn't know that, but I guess that kind of makes sense. I guess I've never really thought about war games, but they're also trying to figure out, I guess it's practice on one hand, but also just seeing what happens.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and also training, young generals without them having to be in a war. That was kind of like where a lot of it came from. But obviously, we have much more, I think, generous and positive goals.
So I know you created this in part so people could explore not just a positive future, but all of these Solarpunk ideas, how they might play out and how, what might happen. But did you also want people to explore how they themselves responded to it?
Yes. I would say that if I'm being frank, the precipitating interests were very quotidian. I was looking to have fun with friends. But all of these are acts that are in dialogue with themselves. Every game you play, gives you something that you want to do more of or less of. And so, it evolves, and finding ways to explore certain questions was definitely something that happens in a kind of iterative process.
I remember you talking in the discussion about for things to be less rigid than in a lot of other role-playing games, so that people really could actually explore things and learn things.
Yeah, this is a topic I think that occurs a lot in like role-playing game circles. There are a lot of people who like to sort of play them like a board game and win at them. Personally, I just that's never been my interest. I like telling stories. And so if anything, it's just a story told where occasionally you roll die because the clacking is soothing. Going back to what Christina was saying about this process of simulating and sort of like finding out what happens, I think that this happens on at least two levels. One is the simulation that goes on in the author's head, or I guess author is probably too flattering word, but the person who's writing the adventure, when I write adventures for friends, there is a sense where it's like, I'll be telling a story and then go, wait, I've hit a block because that requires some condition of our present world that just wouldn't exist, right? And then I have to figure out, like what would exist, and the story sort of takes me in a direction. The other part is the simulation aspect that occurs when it makes contact with the players and you put them into an environment and see what it is that they choose to do with it.
So have you learned anything playing your own game?
Yeah, it's hard to put it into, let's see, that's a great question. I'll say, here's one that just pops up. Are you guys familiar with the term kayfabe?
No.
Kayfabe,
I've heard of it, but like I couldn't tell you the definition, so please.
Kayfabe is a concept that emerges out of professional wrestling. It's the term for the overall environment in which the wrestlers and the fans pretend that it's real despite them all knowing it's fake. Okay.
So that like suspension of disbelief. Sort of.
Right. But, taking it to sort of like the relevance here is, I mean, although it's more common, it's used in a more narrow sense. I've thought a lot about kayfabe. And I think I remember an instance where my brother told me that of a story where there was a pageant for selecting like the merman or mermaid, royalty for some, festival. And the winner was someone who was relatively new to the culture and the subculture. And there was someone who was more experienced and who had really felt that it was owed to them. And then when it wasn't, they were really bitter about it. And after this happened, after they kind of lost this pageant, they started spreading a lot of rumors and trying to raise ire, particularly leveraging the fact that this man, this new like mer king or mer prince, his boyfriend was like a total outsider of the culture. He was like there to be supportive, but like didn't know anything about this. And it was like, and he said, it's funny because this is basically just an accidental recreation of fantasy stories. Like
Snow
you have
White.
like, yeah, you have like the older, royalty who is like, and this guy won because everyone loved him. And it's like, how dare he? I've been putting my time. I was owed this. And you're like, yeah, but he's pure of heart. And it's like, but he's dating a human. How dare he? He's like, this is so funny that like they're pretending, but their pretend is like blending real life and pretend, right? They're falling into the practice, right? And the thing is, I think that this is a concept that has a lot of, currency. Have you guys seen the show Community?
Oh, yes.
Nope.
Okay. Well, for anyone who's listening to this, I think you'll know exactly where I'm going. Community was a sitcom that was famous for creating stories within stories where the characters would be pretending something, but the stakes were real. Like they have to win a game of paintball, but it's like a war film or an action film. And it's like, if they lose, there's terrible stakes. And so they're like treating everything like, with this dire seriousness. Right. And, I think there's also a similarity in the popularity of holodeck episodes on Star Trek. And so it's like, this is just an emerging concept that I think if you imagine stories set in a world where people have a lot of free time and are like also less imposed upon to like signal maturity and signal this kind of patriarchal behavior, then you would see more people pretending things, and they're not just going to divorce it from their lives. You're going to see a lot of people who pretend things and their pretend is like kind of real to them. Not in a delusional sense, but in like a way that we pretend the things that interest us. We pretend to be the things that feel natural to us. And so it's like, this is the kind of like, I had an entire story where they go to a strip club where a cash box was stolen. And part of this was the idea that I like the idea of a strip club is normally seen as a very seedy place. It's low class, and it's also associated with gendered violence but they're called gentlemen's clubs. And I was like, imagine a gentlemen's club, but they have like dancers who are like an artist in residence, right? And it's like, like it's in an environment where no one dances because they're like, this is the only option available to them to feed themselves and like a kid, right? Everyone who's doing this is doing this on their own volition. And then I was like, drew in this idea like, oh, it's like a vampire strip club. Everyone there is pretending to be a vampire, because that's another in vampire fiction. You often see they have like kind of this underworld quality, and so they're all pretending to be vampires. But spoiler, there's no vampires. That's not real. But it's real to them, because like if you lose standing, if you offend the wrong person, like you could get killed in your game, right? So this is a kind of simulation aspect, I guess. It's a little roundabout, but like when writing stories, I don't think most people would necessarily say a principle of Solarpunk is people pretending to be characters in a role play setting. But I found just when writing these stories that was the kind of thing that popped up sometimes.
Yeah, I always thought those holodeck episodes were just because they were all Sherlock Holmes nerds. And they thought this would be fun. Let's do this.
I assume it's also, costuming considerations and a lot of things. But I mean, I think it was just, even if the reasons were otherwise, like the inclusion of it makes sense because they have this sort of post-scarcity, you can do anything world. And so it's like, why wouldn't someone say, well, what if we have one where he's a noir detective, right?
I'm just thinking about Halloween right now and how it's like become the American holiday and everybody's doing it and everyone's decorating and stuff. And because everybody likes to dress up.
We love pageants. And then I guess that, like I said, there's the simulation quality where you're writing a story and the story takes you somewhere where you wouldn't have necessarily started, but it kind of an idea kind of lends itself. And then there's the stuff that happens in the games when you let the players kind of do what they would each do and see where that takes them. An idea that I thought I could bring up is like, there's a misconception that the opposite of a dystopia is a utopia. And there's a writer, I think his name's Kevin Kelly, who wrote an essay. He coined a term protopia. And he said that really the opposite of a dystopia is a protopia. A utopia is, the term is like Greek for nowhere. It's kind of like the horizon, the end of the rainbow. It's sort of defined in being inaccessible. If a dystopia is just a bad world, then the opposite of a bad world is a good world, not a perfect world. As you make a good world, what you find is that you just, it goes places. You can't just say, I want everyone to be happy all the time. I would say that sort of the most ancient conflict in the world is like, you are attracted to someone and they are not attracted to you. And that is a kind of summation of the fact that like, we will never live in a world where everyone is happy, because people can want different things and they can want things that are irreconcilable. And then when you put that onto systems, right, like not everyone can live at the exact same beautiful vantage. If you have a top of a mountain with the best view, someone gets it and someone's going to be disappointed, right?
Christina breaking in to say, I had to run away at this point because the phone rang. And yeah, and so I cut that part out, and now here the discussion continues.
Hey, Christina, just to catch you up, we were talking a little bit about housing while you were away.
Oh, well, I could tell stories about housing. I'm having to sell my mother's house. And the thing is, it's in dilapidated state. It needs a couple $100,000 worth of renovations, but it's in a really good location in a really nice school district. And you say, I have to sell the house. And even before you get to the end of the sentence, they're like, how much do you want? Or before you talk to your realtor, call me, and even yesterday I had to get some documents delivered by DHL, and the DHL driver's like, oh yeah, sorry, I didn't leave these yesterday, but you weren't here and it looked like the house was empty. And he's standing next to the little for sale sign. And he's like, how much do you want? I'm like, not you too.
You're in, this is in Los Angeles, right?
This is in, Torrance. It's, not the most exciting part of Los Angeles.
This is another reason I wanted to talk to you is just because like I enjoy talking to a fellow Angelino, and like, when writing this, again, people, I encourage everyone to sort of set the game wherever it is that they live, because it's just, I think that that's creatively fulfilling and a little easier. But and although I don't live in Los Angeles right now, I lived there for 10 years and it kind of became an adopted home. And I really enjoy imagining, like, what would it look like if, for instance, you, I don't know, moved or shrunk LAX?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. And basically, I think they need to knock it down and start over. It's not, it can't handle the amount of traffic it's got going through it at the moment. But one thing about being from Los Angeles is that you find out everyone hates Los Angeles. They hate it even if they've never been there. And they like to diss it. Like if you read like Kim Stanley Robinson hates Los Angeles. In Ministries for the Future, he rather unrealistically, in terms of the scientific scenario, destroys Los Angeles, like gleefully, because he hates the place. And I'm like, why all the hate? Okay, it's badly designed and you have to drive, but it's immensely multicultural.
I think it has to do with maybe a little bit of jealousy.
I don't know. I mean, everyone has their picadillos, but I happen to really like LA. I think it's a very fun, colorful place. It's sort of it has a lot of silliness. I mean, that's sort of, I don't want to get sidetracked because I could talk for a long time about this. I'll just say that it was appealing to write adventures in Los Angeles because it's such a common setting for like cyberpunk dystopia, and it's a very silly place. If you want an antidote to that, have you read The Lost Cause by Cory Doctorow?
Not yet. It is on my list. I really, really want to read it.
I checked it out of the library a little while ago, a couple months ago. I did not have much luck with it, even though I really, really liked Attack Surface. It was just way too explainy for me, and I gave up after about 50 pages.
I really like it. It takes place in Burbank, which is not really Los Angeles, but it's a part of Los Angeles. And one thing that I love about it is that Cory Doctorow centers the city, and the character talks about like an affection for place. And I think it's something that I would encourage a lot of people to do when writing, is like, don't just write it in like the town of Nevermore, like you don't need to take things away from, like, every place has a history and a culture and an identity. And I think using real places adds a depth that is extremely hard to write from scratch.
Well, I think it would be really interesting to kind of solarpunkize Los Angeles. And you just think about, what transformations are currently happening? How much further would you have to push them? What would you have to change? I mean, you'd also have to change. I mean, there's a lot of different cultures in Los Angeles. There's definitely things you would need to change about certain mindsets. And you'd have to free the LA River and do something about public transportation. But you have, it's one of the interesting things about Los Angeles and the Valley and all of these things is that you had all these different towns, and then they just kind of grew together. But you can kind of see the core of these old towns as you drive around, and they all have a slightly different culture, and they have a slightly different set of inhabitants. And I find this really, really interesting. It's how people think of New York, kind of, but it's not really how people think of Los Angeles.
In Los Angeles, you could say that in some ways it's just like every big city, and you can also say every big city is unique, But like a thing I'll do just when I'm imagining is, one of the nice things is that you're not about writing for a game like this, is that you're not constrained to pure realism. So for instance, you can say, let's just imagine that we got so good. In fact, we invented a technology that lets you drill underground 10 times as fast, right? And so we're going to say we have this magical underground train network, right? And then we're going to say now roads, we're going to constrain them. So instead of being 4 and 5 lanes of cars, we keep 1 lane for buses and a few, larger vehicles, 2 lanes for just foot traffic and bikes, and then 2 or 3 lanes. That's all just going to get rewilded. And every other block, we're going to tear up the asphalt and turn it into like, a wildlife corridor. Also, in one of the games, the 10 freeway has been rewilded, and because it's like in a kind of trench, it's now called the Glen. Everyone's like, oh yeah, I live just north of the Glen. You mentioned something in your email that I wanted to touch on, which is you were talking about how this would affect farmers.
Right, because you were talking about wanting, food being a basic human right, and then everyone should just be able to have food for free, which is a lovely idea. it's a fabulous idea, but I was just imagining how my very conservative farmer neighbors up the street would react to even just hearing about something like that. And they would flip out, they would howl, they would scream, because they're already howling and screaming because farming is hard work. These people, they don't get days off, they don't get vacations. It's a calling for them. Okay, there's some of them who are just in it to be bigger and to make more money. But for a lot of the smaller farmers, it's a life and a lifestyle. And they're not really getting paid enough for what they produce. And that's bad, but it's also really bad because I mean, so first you think, oh, it's good, then people can afford food, but then the farmers are forced to do more with what land they have. And so that means like crowding animals in barns and spraying crops with all sorts of nasty chemicals in order to get more and more and more out of every little acre. It's a really cool idea. I'm sure there's a way to make it work. There's probably many ways to make it work, but you have to figure out what they are.
Yeah, well, I thought about this when you brought it up, and the first thing I said was, and this is, I think I said this a lot in the other episode, like every problem is just an interesting prompt for a story, right? In the last episode, I talked a lot about world building, and I think where this leads us is to sort of the next thing, which is like storytelling, because you start with a background on which to tell stories, but it's like, how is a farmer treated? The real answer to that is, what does the story require? I can give you an example of a story where there's one, and it's about a family feud caused by some high school drama. It's a very fluffy story. And there's a character who is called the Olive King, and she is the head of the local olive growers guild. She is a farmer who is very, very well served in this environment. She is elevated and esteemed with high prestige. And that's because the story required that we have one of the parents of these teenagers who is in a position of great sort of cultural esteem. And, an olive grower just seemed like a fun one. An inverse to this is there's a story that my brother wrote, and it's about a group of mycologists who make a breakthrough that make cultivating truffles far, far, far easier. The story is specifically about a legacy truffle farmer who is just devastated by this development. In one, the story is just about the characters and it's not interrogating the world. In the second one that I mentioned, the story is specifically like almost starting from the premise that you were describing, like how can we examine what it looks like when you happen to draw the short end of the progress stick.
What's interesting is how much literature hasn't addressed this, because obviously this wouldn't be the first time this sort of thing has happened in human history, right? I mean, you had the Industrial Revolution. You can't make a living as a craftsperson since 100 years or more, right? Because everything's so much cheaper if you build it in a factory or weave it in a factory. And yet, who wrote those stories?
Yeah, I mean, they're out there. I think a lot of this has to do with just publishing markets and like what publishers choose to cover. And for one thing, I mean, publishers don't tend to I find they don't tend to trust audiences' intelligence much with nuance, and they tend to like stories about big, violent conflict more than the quiet challenge of seeing your culture threatened. But that's why we're here.
But I think it also has to do with who got to be the writers back during when these revolutions were happening. I'm just thinking, okay, so I know I read a book by Elizabeth Gaskell, or maybe I just saw the movie. I think I probably saw the movie, or maybe it was a miniseries called North and South. The story is a story of, rich people. And during the Industrial Revolution in Britain, and about a factory owner where they're weaving cloth. And it kind of, details a little bit about the lives of the workers and the health hazards they faced and the economic uncertainty and that they're all really poor. But the story is about the rich people and their struggles and their dramas and their romances. And I feel like because to be a writer, especially, 100, 150 years ago, you had to be a person of means.
I actually wanted to share a clip, if I may, because when my brother ran this adventure, I asked him to record it because I wanted to hear it. And also I wanted to have some actual play recordings for people who are still what does this look like in practice? And so I have a 2-minute clip if you want to hear.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Exactly. And now growing truffles anywhere, even in space, is as easy. I mean, it you're aware truffles ridiculously hard to grow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then you're gonna crash the truffle market.
Well, this is a post-scarcity
Yeah,
world.
that's true.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the
No capitalism.
actually, hold on. Actually, when you say that, there's like a look. They all glance at each other, and Nightshade clears her throat and says, funny you should mention. So, a group of some friends that we know from Dr. Hodge's lab when we were all in grad school is coming to hang out, and one of them is Milano Moss, and she is from a truffle growing family. So when we're all having dinner, if you guys can try and be sensitive to the fact that she might not be thrilled about this breakthrough.
I have a question about the world. So it's like,
Yes.
Are there still rich people and poor people? Or is there still like different classes of people?
Yeah, there are different classes, but it's way less related to economics. It's way more related to status. Like without profit making as a motivation, everyone still breaks off into something that's a lot like businesses, but now they're motivated by essentially being a team and trying to be both famous and influential.
So like with this breakthrough, will that threaten her family's status then? Even though it doesn't threaten their safety, but it does threaten their like status as like, they were like the go-to like truffle farmers,
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, like think about it in your industry. Except imagine if everyone's a trust fund kid and no one can really go hungry, and you're like, wow, we just made this like amazing breakthrough that makes what that person does really easy. Don't worry, they can learn something new. And even if they wanted to retire, they can. They don't even need money, but they're like,
ego.
Yeah.
You could see, I mean, this is just, I had to take the shortest possible. That's 2 minutes, but the conversation goes on much longer. And I love the fact that the player immediately was like, wait, but if you just made this thing that's rare, no longer rare, what does that do to the people who supplied it? And it's like, well, it's going to hurt their feelings very badly.
It's interesting how much of an exploration that is. Like it really is a what if, and what are the consequences? That's really, really cool.
I think this is a great case study in like why these stories are fun to write, is because bad stories are one where you have like black and white stories with like a known good and a known evil are so boring. But this is one where you're like, both sides make a lot of sense. You're like, I do feel bad for this person. And then just when you're feeling bad for him, one of the characters is like, but I mean, think about all the people who live in space and would like to enjoy truffles. Like, are we supposed to just ship truffles from Earth into the moon? Are they supposed to go without just to protect this person's feelings? I mean, unfortunately, this is just kind of what progress looks like, and it's good for a lot of people. So, it's sad when things change, but like they can still make truffles. It's just going to change the environment into which they interact, So it's like I think you can see both sides of it very easily.
It's so interesting to hear that, like you take the profit principle just kind of off the table, like this is a post-scarcity society. And then sort of what are the stakes left that people are debating over? And so that's a really interesting facet of that really stuck out to me, because I was having a hard time actually imagining, like if everybody's a trust fund kid and suddenly there's no consequences monetarily for what happens, but there is consequences in terms of reputation, in terms of, identity, personal identity of who you are and things that you are proud to have done.
If you will indulge me, do you mind if I play another clip? It's 1 minute long of the players interacting with this character and how they respond when in their own words.
Okay. I give her the old mechanic slap on the back and be like, cheer up, buddy.
Yeah, let's do a charisma check. Let's see. Wow. She scowls. How is it fine?
Look, we don't have to worry about money. Just like go off and raise goats now instead of mushrooms.
Is that supposed to be a joke? You think my life's work doesn't matter? I know no one's cared about money for decades. That doesn't make it any different.
Barking up the wrong tree, maybe.
My family's been growing mushrooms for generations. How is my father going to feel knowing that all of that is obsolete now?
Well, you know what? I can fix engines, but I can't fix your attitude.
She glowers silently.
So I want to bring up the flip side of this a little bit. Because I think it's also an interesting question is in the Solarpunk world, what do you do with all the innovators? All the people who have to tinker, who have to make things, make it possible to get more done faster using less personal energy.
Well, I think the assumption, at least, in my head, is that you would have anyone who's doing it because they want like a substantial monetary reward is not going to do it. However, anyone who is doing it because they just want the thing to exist will just do it because they want the thing to exist.
Oh, I think innovating is like one of the things we do best. It's something we just do. We have a drive to do it. We tinker with things without even the sort of the carrot of monetization. And yet you can say that all this innovating that we've done is why we've managed to destroy the earth, the surface of the earth here, because we're heedless of the consequences of being able to get more work done faster with less personal energy because, burning fossil fuels and extracting all the resources and destroying all the ecosystems in the process. So, I mean, how do we rein that in? Or sort of like at least prevent it from being this really disastrous thing.
I could answer the question in terms of like, how do I think we should rein it in the real world? But I think a better answer, in the context of this conversation is like, what we should do is, from a writing perspective, find the person that best embodies that problem and then give them the most compelling reason we can think of, and then let them loose on the world and on the characters. So like, for instance, you're asking like, how do we constrain growth beyond responsibility, right?
Yeah, or maybe, yeah, something along those lines. Or at least how do we not just do everything we're able to do, especially as we're figuring out how to do more and more and more and more.
Sure. So I'm just, spitballing here. This is off the top of my head. But one of the groups in this setting is there's a kind of a faith and religious movement called the Seekers. And in some ways they are sort of similar to Earthseed in Parable of the Sower. Like they have sort of a vision of like growing off of our world and into the stars. And so they are very motivated to like colonize Mars. And they come in different versions. There's some that are more secular and there's some that are a little bit like fanatical. So I would take like a fanatical seeker who is so desperate to like grow off of Earth that they want to just build. They're like, how many years will it take for us to build enough spaceships for 12 billion people? And you're like, whoa, we're building spaceships pretty fast, but do you really think we can go that? And then like, what's a consequence of going too fast? Well, a lot of this material, let's say, is coming from like asteroid mining. Maybe they are sloppy and they're trying to move too many asteroids into like a refinery in orbit. And then you have a rogue one that's like coming towards the Earth. And they're like, that's threatening a major city because you were so committed to growth, you didn't heed responsible restrictions. Like that's a kind of story where that I could imagine kind of coming out of this dialogue, this sort of Socratic discourse between the players, the game master, and the various like in-world characters. With that framework, you can choose whether you want to make that person just sort of a model of a bad ideology that we need to reject, or you can sort of hopefully, and I think this makes it more interesting, try and make them make the most sense possible. Try and make them really charismatic and compelling so that people are like, well, I don't agree with them, but I can see why someone would feel that way. I can see why this is difficult to talk someone out of that idea, Yeah,
I don't know if all the innovators have necessarily been greedy, bad people or anything like that. Or, I mean, sometimes it's just a small thing. Just a small thing you're doing, but they add up over the hundreds of thousands of years. And now there's just so many people and so much technology that we're just really effective now.
I'll also add, I think we have a problem where if you have, let's say, two innovators, one who wants to be responsible and the other who wants to be irresponsible, guess which one investors like better?
Yeah.
So it's like, responsible innovators are out there, but we've created a machine that like kind of punishes them.
Or, well, I mean, and this is why you need some sort of third party, like government, for instance, to have regulations. And we've somehow forgotten this, that there's like important roles to be played here by regulatory agencies and standards.
Actually, that's the name of the first campaign is called Regulation. And on the first page, it has a quote, this like fairly like high-minded quote where it's like, where are the celebrations for the regulators that protect our children from badly designed cribs and such? It says like Elizabeth Warren's speeches on regulation, on like government corruption. And then below that, it has the second quote. And the quote is like, regulators, we regulate any stealing of his property. And we're damn good too. But you can't be no geek off the streets. You gotta be handy with the steel, if you know what I mean. Regulators mount up. And then it says Warren G, Nate Dogg, regulate 1994. And I feel like that kind of captures the way the game sort of merges our respect for government regulators today with a less state focused future where like those people can just be like, anyone can be like, I need to intervene. This needs some regulation, you know?
Well, it is interesting. I mean, how do you do it in a free-for-all kind of way? I mean,
again, I think it helps to really ask, what's the story you want to tell? And then sort of work with that. So again, I'm fairly neutral when it comes to like what people want to do with this. If someone even wanted to take this game and say, I want to tell a world that is skeptical of a lot of this very noble language and really challenge it and make a story where I like really point out all the flaws in it, that's fine with me. You know, before I continue, I think it's worth, I just want to mention that there is a podcast, Solarpunk Prompts, that is a collaboration between Tomasino and a recent guest, Powell and the Guy. And they have 3 principles that I think are useful when like helping sort of aim you in the right direction. 1, the community is the protagonist, no superheroes. 2, infrastructure is sexy, no easy solutions. And 3, everything is grounded in the human environmental context. And so I would say take any problem and then, like I said, look for someone who reflects various sides of the problem. Like, you know, there are people who I think are like capitalists who are really skeptical of a lot of these ideas because they're like, no, if you take away the profit motive, everyone gets lazy and the whole civilization collapses. I don't believe that, obviously. But if someone wanted to, they could make a town where it's like, in this town, they're running out of like critical resources because they become very accustomed to like this vat grown food, and the machine just makes food and it keeps breaking down and no one wants to fix it, right? Again, this is not a story that I feel like telling, but you could write that story and then you have someone who reflects the attitude of like this lazy person who it's their responsibility to fix it, but they're like, whatever, I mean, I have enough food, so I don't feel like fixing it. And then you have someone else who's like, I'm going to create incentives. I find this whole idea to be very unnatural to me. But as you see, that's how I would structure that story. So I would take characters and be like, this character represents this attitude. This character represents this attitude. We've made a situation that models the problem that we want to explore. And then we kind of let the story, we wind it up and let it run.
so
Yeah.
I'm going to ask an ignorant question because I have not played, obviously, a role-playing game since I was 14 years old, and it was like D&D, or I don't know, maybe it was Call of Cthulhu. I don't remember. It was a long time ago. But I remember that you could buy like modules, which were, I think, are equivalent to these stories that you're talking about. And, and they would have like a map and the characters and the plot and this and that and the other thing. This is what you mean when you're talking about stories.
Yes.
So are you creating like a library of stories that people can add stories to?
Yeah. So on our website and on the 2 most popular platforms for posting these, we've shared a collection of 4 stories. I and, some friends, we have a lot of notes for stories that we've kind of run on our own. And so if someone said, oh, I really want to play that one that you played a clip of, then I would kind of bundle up all my notes and share them. Eventually we'd like to take a lot of those and sort of clean them up and make them more well formatted for sharing. But in addition, if anyone wants to, what we've done when we wrote the stories was we also just had a template where we're like, here is where you can give a summary of the story. Here is where we put the characters. Here is where we describe themes if you feel like it. And then here's a series of encounters and scenes that you can use, or obviously just kind of once you kind of get the momentum, you can kind of read it less and less, and hard to model how we think it's a useful way of like writing them. And if anyone wants to, they can write their own, or they can even take the existing ones and they can say like, I want to change this for my preferred taste a little bit and write, this is how open source works. You can fork things and then release, a fork of it. And so that's what we're trying to sort of encourage. is for anyone who wants to, they can do this, and then they can either post it on their own blog, or they can give it to us and we'll put it on our website, or they can put it on, we have like a wiki on Lemmy. But yeah, that's absolutely sort of the intention, is to try and share some of these stories that we've written, but encourage as many people as possible to write their own and share those.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you would, like host other stories on your website. And that sounds like a really great idea. I'm, like I've got a little publishing brain sort of going on in the background. I'm like, oh, it's like, like Forgotten Realms. You can just sort of, have an edited collection of stories.
This is actually,
that's further down the road, maybe, but
I don't know exactly where this will go, but one thing that we've discussed among the developers is like, if let's say in a year or two people really there seemed to be an audience for it, I would be happy to find a publisher and be like, look, here's our notes. If you want to find a professional to do it the way that you like to do it, you're welcome to. As long as the original that we've released is still out there, I don't mind if other people want to release a paid version. If people wanted, we could potentially do a crowdfunding campaign and hire artists and hire writers and sort of do something with a little bit more of a professional appearance and quality. At the same time, there are a lot of people that just do like game jams and stuff and write like one-page story ideas, and whatever people want to make, I'm excited about, and I hope that they will try and share it with others so that there's just more for everyone.
That is super exciting. And I love how this is an initiative that is drawing people in, like inviting people to be part of this sort of communal experience. It's not just sort of you're inviting people to co-create with you, which I find extremely exciting.
Solarpunk is all about collectively imagining things, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll also add, I have something of a radical attitude with like intellectual property. I am at the same time very aware that like we're in a situation where creative professionals are so strained and often struggling that like I entirely will in the present day fight for their right to control their own works. But at the same time, in like a big picture sense, I would rather live in a world where no one is told you can't write that because that's owned by someone else. I like the fact that anyone can write Sherlock Holmes. Anyone can write Hercules. And yet, why is it that we have to deal with like, in comic books all the time, you hear about people like, oh, we've had so many bad editions of like Iron Man. And you're like, well, you can go on fan fiction websites and find people with every possible vision. Why don't we just let... The funny thing is there's one of those moments where you're like, what happened to the free market? What happened to, flourishing of ideas? Why can't everyone just compete and we'll say this is the best Iron Man comic out there? And you're like, but it wasn't published by Marvel. Who cares? They are literally a company that pays to put ink on paper and send it to places. They are not really a creative project. The writers who work for them are creatives. They themselves are a logistics company. No disrespect to the publishing companies. Like obviously everyone who works in a publisher, I think, has a creative impulse and is part of a creative process. But I'm saying like to say that like Marvel owns Spider-Man is sort of an absurd idea, like saying, Noah built an ark. You're like, well, it's a nice story, but like, no, that's not true in the literal sense. Like they are a theoretical company. They're not a person, and they can't own Spider-Man. No one can own Spider-Man. Spider-Man is just an idea that exists in all of our heads.
And, I've heard a lot of debate back and forth about the copyright of exactly what you were talking about, of different comic book characters who have existed for like 70 plus years and been written by so many different people that it's sort of, well, there's an idea of the comic book character. But, beyond that, what coheres and what is, I guess, ownable, quote unquote, about that character or that concept or that idea.
I once heard of someone they told me that they wrote adult fiction on the internet for their own personal interest, and someone wrote them asking if they could use the same character. And I find that to be so fascinating because obviously there's have you ever heard of the pathetic red dot theory? This sticks with me so much. It's by Lawrence Lessig, who's like an internet freedom advocate. And the theory is that our culture on the internet, and I think this applies much more broadly, is largely shaped by 4 imposing powers: the law, markets, culture, and physical limitations. So what you can do on the internet, what you can post, what you can say is limited by, for instance, the physical element is like your internet connection. Like you can only post so much data at a time because of your bandwidth. The law is that if you download something that you're not allowed to download, you can get fined or jailed. The culture is like, oh, I don't want to do this because people will get mad at me. And the market is like, I can release this game, but people don't know about it because I don't have a business and an advertising budget. And I think that shapes so much about what we do. And it's interesting. I mean, we want to change all 4 of these in both internet and out of the internet so that we have the flourishing of human ideas and potential. And we want to take them, I think, one at a time. And one of them is like, by just doing something, you establish culture. When we release this game and say over and over, anyone is welcome to just they don't need my permission. They can take this and say, I'm going to make fully automated, Ariel's version, fully automated Christina's version. And they could say, in mine, it takes place 50 years earlier during the like a global climate war. They don't need my permission to do that. And by demonstrating this in my own practices, I hope that more people see that and go, hey, wait a minute. I didn't realize these are things I can do. I just felt like I couldn't do them because, for instance, there's a cultural imposition, but that doesn't carry the weight of, legal threat.
Yeah, it is interesting. Oh, go on, Ariel.
Oh no, I was just saying that's really great. That's I mean, it makes me think of, like open access journals in academia of like, like this information is, you can do with it what you will. It's not proprietary to anybody, and so it doesn't need to be behind a paywall, and you're not going to get sued for using those ideas within whatever it is that you're creating.
Christina here, breaking in to push back a little bit against Ariel's idea of open access publications. Academic papers that are published as open access, that is, freely available instead of being hidden behind a paywall, are still copyrighted. It's just that instead of users paying a fee to access the papers, the writers have paid a fee for open access publication. Also, the ideas in academic papers are not copyrighted. Anyone can build on them. Academic papers are not patents.
Bringing this back around to sort of where this started with simulation, there was an adventure where the players got attacked and they, defended themselves against these attackers who were trying to rob them. And the attackers had some high-tech equipment with them. And one of the players said, I want to examine this equipment to try and figure out, where did it come from? How did they get it? And the nice thing is this was happening right at the end of a 2-hour session. And so this is sort of routine when you're running a game. I don't have answers to that. But I'm like, oh, okay, you start that process. Let's all see each other next week. And then I was thinking, wow, I hadn't really asked myself that question. I need answers to that. And so I sat back and I thought about, like, instead of this all being made in like Taiwan and shipped overseas, it's all manufactured, like this happened in Los Angeles. So I'm like, there's a company in Burbank that made it like 10 years ago. And like the power supplies were made more recently because they need more, like the optics were upgraded 5 years ago. It was sold to a library. It sold to a school system for like, that used it in like classes for 7 or 8 years. And then they sold it to the local library, not sold, but like transferred ownership. And then someone took it out of the library, and that's how it got stolen by this, collective that wanted to use it for harm. Right. And so it's like, I didn't have an answer to that, but because a player was like, okay, what's the chain of ownership for this like VR headset? I was like, okay, I have to come up with answers to this. And like, I came up with a fairly like cohesive story. And it's actually, and then I wrote it up in like the firmware, and I have like a text file. And so the next week when we sat down, I was like, okay, you've done a lot of searching, and here you can find like embedded in like the memory is a history of its like registration files, and it lists like dates of transfer and like where the parts came from. And the whole thing, by the way, is like made from a lot of different modular components. Like some of them were made by one company and some were made by the other, and someone changed something out after it broke, because it's not like, we don't throw out electronics and just buy a new one. And all of this is that kind of simulation, because it's like, I didn't think of it, but because someone asked, I had to think about it. And then because I had to think about it, I gave them answers that I think are really interesting answers that then give them more to think about and more questions to ask. If they want, they could go and call up any of these companies or prior owners. And then I would have to do more thinking, right? That's the cycle of simulating.
This reminds me a little bit of our episode on distributed production or manufacturing, excuse me. And how you deal with exactly these sort of chains of modifications to things in terms of, at least in the framework of the modern world, safety and liability.
Yeah,
you have
that's not
an
an
open source design.
That's not a coincidence. I've been listening to this show pretty much, I think, since you guys started. So the thing is, I mentioned in the last episode, whenever I hear an idea, if I don't have a place, if it's not already in the game, I would be like, ooh, I got to figure that out. So it's like, you guys have talked about the differences between how this manifests in a rural setting versus an urban setting. You guys have talked about, I don't know if it was you guys or someone else who had an episode about education. Seems like something you guys might have done.
It's something we thought about, but we haven't really.
Okay.
We didn't have an episode about full education. Like that might be an Andrewism video or something like that.
That does sound right. But
yeah,
basically, this game actually has a lot of ideas that your podcast is a part of the soil in which this game kind of grows. You know what I mean?
That's great.
The questions that don't have answers yet. Yes, we have
Yeah.
we have a lot of questions because I'm always so confused.
Yeah, that's why we have so many guests. We have so many questions.
Well, it's also, this is something it took me so long to realize that, like, if you tried to make a tabletop role-playing game, like a world guide for our present world, it would be bonkers. Like, how does one build an apartment building, right? You're like, oh, shoot. I mean, I know these things, but do I know them? I guess there's a financer and they have to, how do they find these people? I know what it looks like when you put the wood up and build it, but who do you buy the land from and how do you get the permits and all of this stuff? Just our own world is so complicated, and most of us have been kind of separated from that information because I think it makes us easier to just sort of move around like little pieces. If you're like, you don't need to know that. Everyone just knows their own little thing.
But also, I mean, we all don't who has time to learn how every single thing works, right? That's why there are experts and why we trust the experts to do their jobs, because they know these things. But then it sort of, some people feel like they have to verify things for themselves, right? And so, and that is a really good impulse, but also, it's a constant struggle between how much time do you have and sort of what resources do you have available to you to figure this stuff out. At the end of the day, sometimes it just becomes easier to just kind of go along with whatever somebody else is saying. But yeah, I've often thought about well, I mean, if I was, if I was time traveling and was transplanted back to the, 1600s, I wouldn't know how to make a light bulb. I wouldn't know how to get all these things to work that I usually sort of rely on for my daily life. I could not even explain it to someone who had the skills, like a carpenter or an electrician. If for some reason there was an electrician who just didn't know about, light bulbs or something, I would not be able to, describe what, I mean, I'm sure I've learned in grade 3 or 4 about, batteries and negative charge and stuff like that. But that's all been sort of shunted out of my brain to make room for all the stuff that I learned in my PhD. So, it's a real problem, I think, because the world is really complex because there's so many people with so many ideas in it,
Yeah. And also, I mean, the examples that you give, oftentimes our education, I think, focuses on just sort of microcosms and single examples of a piece of hardware. But how we get internet and electricity and water, the infrastructure that we all take for granted, is extremely, opaque. And like a lot of these systems do need radical changes, like in California, the way we get our water needs to be completely rewritten, like it's Raleigh Williams Climate Town is another great resource that like, have you guys seen anything by Climate Town?
I've seen it around, definitely. It's
He has
something
an
that
episode
keeps
on.
popping up in my recommended.
Yeah, I love Climate Town. And like, he has a whole episode on like how badly our water rights were written from the start. Water rights, that's another thing where it's like we barely understand it now. And so how are we supposed to imagine what a good version looks like when we don't even understand, most of us, what the bad version looks like or what its problems are? Fortunately, we can do research, and like this is again the cycle of creation is like, you might have a story where you want to say, I want to have a story about people arguing over water. And then you start looking up, YouTube videos on people arguing over water and be like, okay, so what parts of this are we going to keep? But what parts are we going to say like, well, we're not going to do that because that's obviously wrong. We have a better version, but like, we're going to still tell a story about the same emotional stakes.
And how you deal with scarcity in a post-scarcity world.
Yeah,
there are physical limits sometimes.
Absolutely. Like when I think about scarcity, it's really more through the lens of like sharing and minimizing need. But like there is not a limitless amount of land. There is not an infinite amount of water. These are challenges that are ripe for us to enjoy telling stories about.
Well, they're ripe for us to solve because they are becoming existential crises.
Yeah.
That too.
And we need to solve them through, creative thinking. So that's exactly what we're talking about.
Another thing that's nice about this kind of genre, by which I mean like comic booky mass media stuff, is it sort of lowers the stakes. Because if you're writing like legitimate highbrow fiction, I think that the expectation to get all of your fact checking research right is much higher. In this, when your audience is just a couple of friends, you have a much greater degree of personal grace, I think, to just make things up. And if it's wrong, that's okay. You're not claiming to be an expert. But if all of us do this, it makes it so that we don't feel afraid to explore ideas, which I think is a key element of like hacking. What happens if we do this? Let's break a system and find out. No bad ideas.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to sit down and elaborate more on this amazing project that you have, Andy.
Well, thank you so much. And, anytime, like, I don't know where it'll go in the future, but if at any point in the future you have other questions or ideas, I am always glad to talk to you guys.
And that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you haven't already, go over to fullyautomatedrpg.com and give this Solarpunk role-playing game a go. Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel, Kroon, and Christina de la Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents.
Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews.
Until the next episode, keep dreaming.
And stay Solarpunk.